I'm Jan Martinson, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm president of the Taos Chapter of the Native Plant Society of New Mexico. And now I'd like to introduce Pam McBride. Pam I've known since I've started serving as the Taos representative to the state board, which was, I think, it was 2013, I think, or 2014. But Pam's been an active member of Native Plant Society of New Mexico for how many years? 20?
I don't know.
A long time. But she's served in various capacities in Albuquerque. You've been the president in Albuquerque and various other positions there, and she's been on the state board as secretary, finance committee chair, and now treasurer. Pam graduated from the University of New Mexico in 1990 with a BS in anthropology and has been doing archaeobotanical research analysis ever since, earlier even, 1988. She's worked in the Portugal, Alentejo region of Portugal on an Islamic period site, and in all the Four Corners states of the Southwest. She's had her own consulting business since 1994 and is currently the director of the Paleoethnobotany Lab at the Office of Archaeological Studies at the Museum of New Mexico. That makes a big card, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah, so Pam is going to introduce the world of Paleoethnobotany to us. Thank you, Pam, for reminding me.
What I'm here to do tonight, I hope, is to explain to you what paleoethnobotany is and how we go about doing this discipline. And then I want to talk about some of the more common plant remains that we find from archaeological sites, and a couple of the not so common plant remains from archaeological sites. And then finally, I want to talk to you about some somewhat odd ethnobotanists who have been an inspiration to us and a source of information for within our discipline. So paleoethnobotany is the study of the relationship between plants and people. And we elucidate that relationship by studying archaeobotanical remains, including both microbotanicals, which include pollen, which I don't do. It's just like windows. I don't do windows and I don't do pollen. And macro remains, which can include seeds. If it's an agricultural site, we'll find cob parts, corn cob parts, beans, etc. So then the next question is, okay, so how do we retrieve these plant remains so that we can study them from archaeological sites? And we do this by identifying carbonized plant remains. We consider unburned plant material is usually non-cultural from open air sites. When you have a site that's either a cave, a rock shelter, then you can have really good preservation of unburned plant materials such as bird snares. We've found sandal fragments or whole sandals, unburned corn cobs, and so those are pretty obviously cultural when we find those in cave situations. But in open air sites, those unburned plant remains can be there because of during excavation. We can bring them into the site. They can be brought in by wind, by rodents, etc. So we focus on the carbonized plant remains, and the assumption is that they were carbonized as an accident during processing of the plants, cooking them. They dropped some in the hearth, and voila, there we have our plant remains to study. So, there are two ways of retrieving these remains from the sites. So when we're excavating a site, we just pick up any remains that we can see with the naked eye. So that would be something like a corn cob or large pieces of wood charcoal. We might bag those separately and bring them back to the lab. And then the other method is flotation, which is a water separation technique. So we will say we have discovered a hearth on the floor of a pit structure. And we either take the entire contents of the hearth, or we concentrate on the base of the hearth, which the assumption there is that that was the last use of the hearth, because when the site is abandoned, it then is filled in with post-occupational fill, which may or may not have anything to do with the actual occupation of the structure. So we collect those samples, we bring them back to the lab, and the first step is we measure them in a graduated cylinder or, you know, a measuring cup, and we record that volume of soil, and then we pour it into a bucket of water, and we use the sprayer to create a vortex in the water. And so this causes a spiral that causes the light fraction, as we call it, or, you know, the plant material to float on the surface. And then we decant that into a piece of chiffon material. It's not just for ball gowns. and we keep repeating that. Well, first we rinse any silt that might have gotten included in that out of the sample. And we keep repeating that, refilling of the bucket, decanting it until we don't see any more plant material floating on the surface. And so then we gather up what we call, especially if it's white chiffon, we call it a ghostie. And we hang it in a shady place to dry. So why do we use a shady place? Well, because it has all this plant material in it, like charcoal fragments, and those, if they're dried too quickly, can crack, and then it makes it far more difficult to identify them. And by the way, then we take that material, I put it through a set of geological sieves. So they're graduated, and that separates out the material that has floated and dried, obviously, because it just makes it easier to look at the sample. If you look at it all at once, you're seeing all these different sizes of plant material. And so then I identify seeds and other plant parts under the microscope. And so this seed is one, goosefoot or CHENOPODIUM. We can't identify it to species. These two, by the way, the white stuff there is part of the papery testa that covers the seed. Each CHENOPODIUM plant produces thousands of seeds. So when they would bring these, they would collect them in perhaps a basket. Today we use a paper bag and put it over the plant and shake it, and then you have all these seeds that you take and you can parch, and they would ground them and add them to cornmeal and either make like a porridge or steam little balls of that mixture. Various things they could do, use it as flour. And so we find this particular genus in just about every single archaeological sample from early archaic all the way up through some historic sites. Next is PURSLANE or PORTULACA, which I'm sure if you grow vegetables, you will have noticed this plant volunteering in your garden. It's very prolific, and that's what it did prehistorically too, I'm sure. And so we do find that, not as often as goosefoot, but, and this too, the somewhat succulent-like leaves of this plant were steamed and eaten as greens. So
how large is that seed? You didn't have a scale on that one.
Oh, it's about the same size as the goosefoot.
Okay.
If not smaller. And this is an example of cob fragments that are not unlike ones that we find normally at archaeological sites. So the one on the right, on the far right, is carbonized, and the other two, I'm not sure why they're there, because it's pretty darn rare that we find uncarbonized corn cobs from a site. And so these are maize kernels that still retain their embryos. So the embryo is right here. And so that is somewhat significant because one researcher did some research and she discovered that when people treated corn kernels to make hominy with some kind of type of lime, which would have been ash, then they were more likely to lose their embryos. And they would swell and lose their embryos. So when we find kernels that haven't lost their embryos, we can make the assumption that they were just dried and stored that way and not processed with lye. Now these are an example of kernels missing their embryos. You see this depression here, and they're swollen and somewhat deformed. And so that could be an interpretation we would make in finding these types of kernels, that they had been treated with ash to make hominy. These we run into once in a while. What this is several cobs, carbonized cobs, fused together. So the interpretation here is that when you find these, whether they're stored in a storage pit or a room, they were stacked up on top of each other with the kernels still on them, obviously, and then they lost their pith during the conflagration. There was some kind of a fire. And I found a lot of these up in Los Alamos when I was working on one particular site there. A whole room had burned, and this was the result. So, can anybody tell me what these are? Anyone want to take a guess? Oh. No, that's a good guess, though. She said a gall. These are pinon nuts with their cone scales still attached. And we found Normally, you do not find especially whole pinon nuts. You find little tiny fragments that they've probably spit out into the fire, because normally my theory is the reason why we don't find a lot of these at sites is because, unlike us, they just ate the whole bloody thing. They didn't, you know, shell their nuts. So these are very rare to find whole ones, but we found, I don't know if these are the actual ones from the Palace of the Governors when we excavated there prior to the building of the new History Museum in Santa Fe, that there were pits of whole pinon nuts, and my theory there was that the governors often exacted tribute from the indigenous people, the Pueblo people, and then they would take those loads of whatever, tribute items, and sell them down in Mexico. So, so that's what that is. And then I wanted to show you, a lot of times we find just this part of the cone scale. So this is a pine cone scale, and that's a really bad scale there, but that's what my picture. So here's the cone scale, the whole cone scale, and this is the umbo. So when we find those, we can, you know, if we're just finding those and not a lot of the pinon nutshell, we can make the interpretation that people were using this method of collecting pinon nuts, and that is they would go and collect the cones when they were slightly green before they opened. So they were beating the squirrels and the chipmunks and whoever else would go and get those nuts, and so they would take the cones either back to their village or process them right there, dig a roasting pit, and roast them in the cones, and then the cones would release the roasted nuts, so they'd have them right there. So, and this was documented by not one of the ethnobotanists that I'm going to be talking about, but somebody else. So, these were fragments, and I'm sorry I don't have a scale here. They're all different sizes, actually, running from less than a centimeter to maybe 3 centimeters long. And I just could not figure out what the heck these things were, and I was finding them to some degree from northern New Mexico sites, but primarily from southern New Mexico. So finally, when we worked on a project on New Mexico 128, they were improving the road for the WIP project in Carlsbad. A colleague and I were down there interviewing a rancher on where he had seen archaeological sites in the area and where he had noticed springs before the potash mine completely obliterated most of these springs. So my colleague and I went out to look at an archaeological site that this guy was pointing at, and I literally tripped over this. And what it was a dead, dried up yucca plant. So these are actually the base. The leaves come out from here to some degree. I mean, it's weird. But anyway, they're the base of the caudex of the yucca. So they could have either been using these very dry, very good for tinder pieces of yucca caudex for starting their fires, or they could have been processing the hearts of the yucca in the same manner that they roasted agave hearts.
Are these carbonized?
Yeah, these are carbonized. Then here was another mystery. This came from privies that we were excavating in downtown Santa Fe before they put in a new big parking lot there. And I thought, what in the heck are these? And again, I'm sorry for no scale, but they're not very big. And they're kind of papery, and I thought, do they have to do with figs? Do they have to, because we found fig seeds, do they have to do with dates? I just couldn't figure out, and then a colleague discovered that indeed what they were, and they amazingly survived the intestinal tract of the people using the privy. This is the apex of a pinon nut. And so this structure that was a puzzle is called a nucellus, and it's at the attachment end of the pinon nut. And so there we had direct evidence that they were ingesting pinon nuts without the actual nut, because the nut doesn't survive. It's too starchy, too fragile. These were from a site in Alamogordo, and Philip and I went down to look at the site and try to determine what they might be. I was pretty sure they were marginal leaf spines of an agave, and I think they're two different agave marginal leaf spines. And at the moment I can't remember which species, but that's what they turned out to be. It was very difficult to find any agave in the foothills of Alamogordo. They've all been harvested or just built over. So,
do you have a date on those from the site? Historic or prehistoric?
Prehistoric. I think it was like AD 800 or 1100, something like that. So now I want to talk about 4 ethnobotanists who worked from the middle 1800s to the early to mid 1900s. So this is not a picture of a friend of mine from the 1960s. This is Frank Hamilton Cushing, who was quite a character. He was born in Pennsylvania, but grew up in Western New York, and he, as a young boy, was very interested in he found artifacts in the plowed fields of his family's farm, and he also went exploring in the woods around where he lived, and he found what he called an old Indian fort. And he investigated it to the best of his ability at the age of 15 or 16. And he actually wrote and published his first scientific article at the age of 17. And 2 years later, he was named the curator of the archaeological collections in the exhibit of the National Museum at the Centennial Exposition in Pennsylvania. And the chief of the Bureau of Ethnology at the time was John Wesley Powell, as you know him probably from his expeditions to the Colorado River, and you know, it was quite something. And he took notice of Cushing, and he invited him to join an expedition, an anthropological expedition out west. And so they took a train as far as they could, and then they took wagons out to ZUNI. And Cushing ended up staying at ZUNI, and he was eventually adopted by the governor of ZUNI, and he was initiated into the Bow priesthood, which to this day, people at ZUNI resent and just don't have a lot of good things to say about him. But, you know, I say, well, it was the people themselves at that time that seemed to accept him. He was one of the first, he was the first anthropologist to become a participant observer. And if you don't know what that is, you can ask me later. But whether you think that's a good thing or not, some people think that's not such a great thing. Methods have changed since then. So on the negative side, Cushing did a really bad thing. He went back east and he made a mud head mask, and he was in the Smithsonian posing with the mask on, and there was a photographer taking pictures of him, and the Zunis, for the Zunis, this was the ultimate betrayal, because, you know, this was part of their religious ceremonial life, and that was just a really big betrayal. But he did do at least one good thing at a point in time in 1870. Well, see, this says 1877, but he didn't get there till 1879. So, but at some point, the Zuni territory was mapped in a way that excluded part of their territory, which was called the Nutria Valley. It had been left out of the boundaries of the reservation. And then suddenly 3 land speculators show up at Zuni, and they say, well, we're going to take this land and create a cattle ranching operation. So Cushing started a letter writing campaign to newspapers in Chicago and Boston, and that really got them their land. That land was then included in a redrawing of the boundaries. But one of those men was related to a Senator Logan, who was really influential in the Republican Party, and he was really angry at Cushing for defaming his reputation, and so he put pressure on Powell and said, you got to send this guy, you got to kick him out of Zuni. So Cushing was forced to go back to Washington. And so Cushing did various expeditions, one in Maine, one in Florida. He did some excavations at Marco Island in Florida. But he had a most unfortunate demise. He died after choking on a fish bone while on a research project in Maine. And he died on April 10th, 1900. He wrote several accounts of his life at Zuni. But the one that we refer to the most is Zuni bread stuff, this one right here. And it's really well written. You really have to go through a lot to get a copy of it. I have brought one with me. I've brought one of each of the individuals I'm going to be talking about. I've brought one of their publications. But it's really worth reading because he has a great sense of humor. And some of the things he writes about are unbelievable, and that's because the Zuni people often lied to him. They really loved pulling his leg. So, this is Matilda Coxe Stevenson. The picture on the left is of Matilda around 1875, taken by Charles M. Bell, and he was part of this expedition, this anthropological expedition. He was one of the photographers. And the grande dame of all things Zuni on the right presumably was taken later, probably closer to 1915. So she was born in San Augustine, Texas, but grew up in Washington, D.C. And she married James Stevenson, who was the leader of that expedition out west. And she was an unpaid assistant. Of course, women were always unpaid back then. And she was definitely not a fan of Cushing. They were both at ZUNI at the same time, and there was a lot of rivalry between them. She felt he wasn't really educated enough, and but this is emphasized in this comment that I'm going to show you, which she wrote on the back of the photograph that I showed you of Cushing. Frank Hamilton Cushing in his fantastic dress worn while among the Zuni Indians. This man was the biggest fool and charlatan I ever knew. He even put his hair up in curl papers every night. How could a man walk weighed down with so much toggery? So she definitely did not have much respect for him. So she and her husband formed a husband-wife team in anthropology. They went various places in the Southwest to Arizona, and they surveyed various archaeological sites and geological features in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. After her husband's death in July of 1888, she was hired temporarily by Powell to get her husband's notes. I bet she had a lot to do with this, more than her husband probably, on an ethnology of the Zia Indians who, you know, their reservation is, you know, it's outside of Albuquerque, going towards Cuba. So then this temporary appointment became permanent in 1890, and she became the first paid woman government anthropologist. It wasn't, get this, until the 1960s before another woman would become a paid anthropologist. So, her first major published paper was The Religious Life of the Zuni Child. But the one that we use and refer to most is The Zuni Indians and Their Uses of Plants, originally published as the Ethnobotany of the Zuni, and that was in one of the Bureau of American Ethnology publications. So, but Matilda was certainly an independent thinker, and her relationship with one of the more well-known LHAMANA, or two-spirit people of Zuni, illustrates this somewhat. The LHAMANA were men who lived in part as women, wearing a mixture of women's and men's clothing and doing a great deal of women's work, as well as serving as mediators. They were highly regarded at Zuni. Matilda and WEWHA, Matilda met WEWHA at Zuni in 1879, and Matilda claimed that her sex was so well hidden that she had no knowledge that she was a man. And we can only conclude that this must have been true because they traveled together to Washington, D.C. and lived together for 6 months. So sometime after 1904, Stevenson did discover WEWHA was a male, and yet she continued to refer to WEWHA in her diary as she. Stevenson explained, as the writer could never think of her faithful and devoted friend in any other light, she will continue to use the feminine gender when referring to WEWHA. So Stevenson hired WEWHA to make ZUNI religious pottery that would later be displayed at the National Museum in Washington, D.C. She was an accomplished potter. She used all the protocols, the religious protocols that went with making ZUNI pottery. So Matilda moved to New Mexico in 1904 and bought a ranch near San Ildefonso Pueblo because she wanted to fulfill her life's purpose. She thought she wanted to do a comparison of the religions of all the Pueblos, but this was not to be. She never finished. She died in June of 1915 without accomplishing that. So next, I can get this to work, we have Edward Franklin CASTETTER. CASTETTER was born in 1896 in Cole Township, Pennsylvania. So he received his master's in botany from Penn State University and his doctorate from Iowa State University. But he became chair of the biology department at UNM in 1928. And he remained in that position for 29 years. And he was instrumental in defining the new discipline of ethnobotany. And he began the CASTETTER Laboratory for Ethnobotanical Studies, which is now in the UNM Herbarium. And at the time I was in school, that was the herbarium, and that CASTETTER laboratory was in the basement of the biology building. And that's where I met two of my mentors, Glenna Dean and Molly Toll especially, who helped me with an honors thesis. I was doing research on macrobotanical remains from what they call the SU site, which is near Reserve, New Mexico. And that's how I started my career in paleoethnobotany. So many of CASTETTER's graduate students did research on plant use in the Southwest by the various pueblos, and they were published by UNM under the title Ethnobiological Studies in the American Southwest. So the following are among them. The one on the top is the one that we refer to the most, and I brought a copy of that as well, and that is also something that is very difficult to get a hold of. So if you want to look through it. So the information I got about CASTETTER is from a master's thesis by Rita Louise Benecek, and it was surprisingly called Human Soil, the Ethnobotany of Edward Franklin CASTETTER, and I thought, where the heck did she get that kind of a weird title? But it came from CASTETTER himself, it turns out. He stated in a treatise that he did on the study of ethnobotany, ethnobotany had much to say about the human soil, the social and economic conditions out of which agriculture grew. And CASTETTER retired in 1961, and the biology building at UNM was renamed CASTETTER Hall in 1968, and that's the picture of the sign on the outside of the building, on the entrance to the building, where I studied botany. So this is Leonora Scott Muse Curtin. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to tour her house. It was one of the field trips that was offered during the annual meeting that was hosted by the Santa Fe chapter. If you ever get a chance to go to her house, which is on Acequia Madre in Santa Fe, it's fascinating because she was an avid supporter of and promoter of local artists. She had a shop downtown at one point in downtown Santa Fe that sold the furniture that was made locally and other arts and crafts. And her house is full of these things. Philip was taking so many photographs that the curator said, "What are you going to do with these things, with these photographs?" And I said, "Don't worry, he's not going to do anything other than look at them." So Leonora Curtin maintained a lifelong interest in the art, archaeology, and cultures of Spanish and Native American New Mexico. She first came to Santa Fe with her mother as a small child in 1889, and then she was taken to England to be educated at the age of 12. She was married, etc., and when her husband passed away in 1911, her daughter, also called Leonora, very confusing, who was 8 years old, they moved to Pasadena to live with the elder Leonora's mother, who was an artist, preservationist. Her name was Eva Scott Fenyes, F-E-N-Y-E-S. So they were world travelers, and after 1916, they spent part of each year in Santa Fe. They were founding members of the Spanish Colonial Arts Society. They were named by Dr. Edgar L. Hewitt to the Board of Regents and the Women's Board of the Museum of New Mexico. She served on the executive board of the School of American Research and the board of directors of the Southwest Museum of Los Angeles, California. Of course, and here she is in Pasadena, or in California, picking wildflowers. It's quite a outfit.
Gloves on.
Yeah. Net, hair net, and well, I mean, you know, net and all. So Leonora's contribution to ethnobotany was she did interviews with friends in Santa Fe and curanderas and native healers. She went as far as San Luis, Colorado, up and down the Rio Grande. And that book was called Healing Herbs of the Upper Rio Grande, and I brought that book here too for you to look at. And this was, she interviewed these people, and it was about the uses of local herbs and plants by Spanish American and Native American cultures. She also went to Morocco to study the origins of the use of herbs in Moorish Spain. She really felt strongly that, you know, the influence of the Moors on Spain was brought over to the New World when the Spanish came here. She was encouraged in all of these pursuits by Hewitt, who was a Smith, or by Harrington, sorry, J.P. Harrington, who was a Smithsonian scholar. And the other book that she wrote was called By the Prophet of the Earth, which is about the uses of plants by the Pima Indians. I also have that, but I didn't bring it with me. So in 1932, Mrs. Curtin and her daughter Leonora purchased historic El Rancho de las Golondrinas in La Cienega. They leased part of the property to a dairy but kept a portion for a country retreat. Following World War II, when Miss Curtin, the daughter, married Finnish diplomat Y.A. Paloheimo, the couple and their children came from their home in California to spend summers at the ranch. And they began to restore and reconstruct the buildings on the site. They were aided in this reconstruction work by historians, architects such as John Gaw-Meem, who, if you're unfamiliar with him, he designed, I believe, the Chemo Theater in Albuquerque, and I know he did I think it's now the Center for Southwest Studies, which is part of the Zimmerman Library. Very interesting Southwestern kind of deco design. And artisans using traditional methods. So El Rancho de las Golondrinas opened as a living history museum of New Mexico's Spanish colonial heritage in 1972. The museum is now owned by an independent charitable trust, but I think that family members continue to participate in direction, operation, and educational mission. And the Leonora Wetland Preserve is also located on this historic property. So, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.